getting so much that they do that. They're the largest ocean organization I've ever seen.
Well,
They pick up so much.
The first one, her birthday is in December, but she decided this year that her birthday is in December, but she's going to celebrate her birthday, celebrate her birthday anymore.
Enforcement.
Because she doesn't like to have her birthday. So she said people should have to live together. Too many people either don't want to celebrate on his notice, they shouldn't have. Or she said, you know, that her family feels like they have to get together for her birthday, which is the 17th. And then they have to get together again.
They're very good.
Christmas. So she said, well, I'm just gonna have presents around your birthday in July. And then people are going to get together. And why not? Yes.
Pro environment. No, I know.
Yes, but I don't know what.
I mean, it sounds like she must be.
I mean, especially in cooking.
But they're definitely
Like a podcast. Where do you think we should spend July?
I got on my calendar to bake some more on Saturday, to make sure I got it. That's what I was saying. I'm gonna make some more on Saturday, so I have enough for.
Looks like about 4 minutes. Okay. And maybe if you could kind of like stand like one of the chair, like sort of like one of the chairs. So if you can look here, you can see kind of where the camera is. So if you could stand like kind of where the camera can see, and then next to the chair on this side.
On the right side?
Yeah.
So you guys did it. You have the door open. That is. You can kind of see why you would like it. Because it's in a little enclosed thing. You don't have a, you have a cage for them. That you need to. And then you put it. He didn't like that.
Yeah. It's a journal.
Oh, this is weird.
She said, the one. No.
Oh, you see those are mountains. Now I should. That was one. No, this is Sunday. Okay, coming. Yeah. So it's. Slush. Slush. Well, it's good you waited until one time. I came over at. And they're both watching. You think they're actually watching it? Are we? You know, you want us to move past there, but then I would be away.
No. No, I can move out of here. Can you move one more chair? Or we'll do this. They'll move up there. I'll sit up there.
Are you gonna be? Well, here. How come? Is this better? Is that all right? I hope I didn't move the chart. No,
6:59 will be 7%.
Okay, sounds good.
That was a natural quieting. Thank you all so much for being here and for choosing to be in community this way. In case you didn't know, you are in a library lecture series sponsored by the Friends of Haystack Rock and the Cannon Beach Library. This season's library lecture is in honor of and celebration of our dear friend Sandy Lundy. This happens the second Wednesday of every month between November and April. And so we have one more after this on April 12th about the monitoring of migratory birds in Lincoln County, Oregon through citizen science. Tonight, we will hear from Josh McInnes. He's a marine mammal scientist and graduate student at the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries Marine Mammal Research Unit. He will share a presentation titled Transient Killer Whales of the Outer Coast of Oregon and California. Josh is from the windy seaside city of Victoria, British Columbia. His research focuses on the ecology and behavior of marine mammals in British Columbia and Monterey Bay, California. Studies focusing on the foraging behavior, diet, and ecology of transient killer whales. And tonight, he'll share insights for the latest findings regarding ecology, abundance, distribution, and community structures of these whales along the outer coast and offshore waters of Oregon and California. So we are also on Facebook Live, and questions will be coming in there as well as here. Without further ado, hand over to Josh.
Well, thanks for having me here today. I've probably chatted with many of you, probably on social media or elsewhere. We've been tracking a lot of the killer whale reports that have been happening up and down the Oregon coast and California. And we're seeing a lot of really interesting findings, which for me and my partner, Chelsea, who's here with me today, we both do research together. And we're really excited to share what we're seeing and what to look out for, especially because if you're in this area, chances are you might see killer whales in the next few months. So I'm a marine ecologist. I work with the Pacific Wildlife Foundation as well as the University of British Columbia, as well as a nonprofit that we've created called the Oceanic Ecology Research Group, which focuses on marine mammal species along the outer coast of Oregon, California, and in British Columbia and Washington. So I grew up in British Columbia, but I also really enjoy the California coast in Oregon. I think it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I spent the last 5 to 10 years going down to California, trying to learn more about the killer whales and the different marine mammals that are there. And one of the big data gaps I found was Oregon. And what is really happening? We know that killer whales span the entire Pacific coast, all the way from Alaska down to Southern California. And all the papers that have been pretty much published have been in British Columbia and Washington State. So what is really happening elsewhere? Oregon, California. A lot of the Oregon coast can be pretty remote, and same with Northern California. So we found that it was important to try to put together some sort of initiative to collect information, to look at the habitat that these animals are spending their time in, how they might be interacting with fisheries, with other marine mammals. And so 3 years ago, we founded a social media group on Facebook as a kind of a fun project called the Oregon Coast Killer Whale Sightings. And now it's up to 8.5 thousand members local to Oregon. And the last 2 years, we've been getting numerous reports of killer whales all over the coast. And that's increasing to the point where people are saying that locals that spend time on the water are like, well, is this something unusual happening? Are we seeing more whales? Is this weird? And then also, because of that, a lot of the people that join the group have photographs historically in their data from, say, their albums that they collected 10 years ago, have been able to contribute that data to us now, and we're collecting all sorts of new info on groups that have previously not been seen in Oregon, are new animals that we've never identified before, and we'll kind of go over a little bit about that. So this presentation, I'm going to be kind of some of the objectives. We kind of going over. I'm going to try to discuss a little bit of some baseline information on the predatory role of transient killer whales, and why I'm going to focus on transient killer whales are because they're the most commonly seen ecotype, and the ecotype literally means a form of killer whale that's genetically distinct. So we have 3 types of killer whale that live in the northeastern Pacific, 3 ecotypes that are genetically distinct: residents, transients, and offshores. So residents, you all have heard probably the southern residents that are critically endangered. There's Chinook salmon specialists that live up in Washington State, British Columbia. They do show up off the Oregon coast, as well as off California. But orcas that we usually see down here are more mammal hunting specialists, and these are the transients. So we're going to talk a little bit about them in what we call the California current large marine ecosystem. So the Oregon coast is within the California current, which is one of the most productive transboundary eastern currents along the entire west coast. So we'll also look at, we'll talk about the community structure. So really, are we seeing more than one group of transient killer whales? Are we seeing multiple different groups of transient killer whales that have different territories or different areas? What differs from the Oregon coast from maybe British Columbia, from California? We'll also look at talking about a little bit of seasonal occurrence, prey species, and habitat use patterns of transient killer whales without this whole area and what we're kind of seeing. So first off, though, the open ocean. Oregon coast, you look out, you see the open ocean goes off for thousands and thousands of kilometers offshore. Some of us have spent time fishing out there, either for tuna or just being out in the open ocean. It's a pretty spectacular place. It often seems empty and remote and desolate at times, but there are orcas out there, or killer whales out there. And what we do know of in the northeastern Pacific Ocean is that, and particularly the groups that we're looking at that spend time out there near the continental shelf break or further offshore, is these transients, which I'm going to be focusing on. We also kind of see this other form that's really interesting. We're not even sure what they are, but it's kind of new. Some of the data we've been collecting from tuna fishermen, from NOAA scientists on survey ships, that there's potentially some oceanic individuals that we're not sure if they're transient or what they are. We also have the last one here, these offshore killer whales, which are genetically distinct from the transients, that feed on sharks and spend most of their time quite far offshore, sometimes coming inshore, live in big groups. That's a whole different subject that I could go another hour or two into, potentially another time. But first off, the transient population geographically spans the entire northeastern Pacific Ocean. And this isn't even the extent of it. We're now finding that they're up into the Arctic Ocean, up into the Chukchi Sea, up into the Sea of Okhotsk. They're way up throughout all these areas, even off Japan. For the most part, though, most studies have been focused in the areas you can see here. And these are different populations within the transient ecotype, that genetically distinct community killer whales that we call mammal hunting orcas. So, for instance, here, these different colors represent the different populations that are also genetically distinct from each other. So, for instance, the big yellow area, which is the Bering Sea, the Aleutian Islands, the Gulf of Alaska, represents a population we know as the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, Bering Sea, or or the gab stock. And they're genetically distinct. We don't know a lot about them, but what we do know is that there's close to probably around 300 to 400 animals that are seen throughout this region that feed way up into the Bering Sea. And there's still NOAA currently, from some of the researchers I've chatted with, kind of thinking of even delineating or distinguishing this stock into multiple other stocks. So it gets very complex and confusing. The other that little blue dot up at the top is what we call the AT1s, or the Chugach transients. Now they're really interesting because there's only 7 left in the world. When they were first discovered in 1984, there was 22. And after the Exxon Valdez oil spill that hit Prince William Sound, it decimated the population to around 12 to 13 animals, and then subsequently more passed on, died and passed away and disappeared. And now we're down to, they've only seen 4 or 5 in the last year or two. So, and there's no reproductive female. So at this point, the population is likely critical and it's going to go extinct. But the population that's most well known is the West Coast population. And that is a bit of a gray area here, because even though they're the best known, means that the more we know about them, the more questions we have. And you can see here the purple into the green is this distribution of the West Coast population. And that's from Southeast Alaska down to Southern California. But over the years, the last at least 20, 30 years, we've been discovering there's a bit of an uneven distribution within this population, with a lot of animals spending their time in the coastal areas off Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Washington. And then, though, off California, you probably all watched Blue Planet. You've seen the killer whales attack gray whale calves. It's kind of well known. Off of California, there might be a different area down there that seems to be where another group spends most of their time. Initially, they were considered all one stock, but now we're starting to learn that there might be subpopulations or groups of individuals that have their own little territories and areas. So that big question mark too is what happens in the open ocean. So what we're finding is that this West Coast population has a bit of a group that spends time in the coast, really close to shore, and then a whole bunch that spend a lot of time further offshore. So this is a photograph taken off Oregon. This was off Newport, roughly around 170 nautical miles offshore. And these were mammal hunting specialists. And what's really interesting about this photo, this was taken by NOAA scientists aboard a research ship, is the big male over there. When I was sent photographs from the researchers at NOAA, we could not identify the group. And I'll explain what I mean by identifying the whales. The big male is the only animal we recognized. So the rest of the animals were unknown to us at the time. So where are these animals spending their time? Most killer whales had been cataloged in other parts of the world. So this is what was really interesting to us, is really where are these animals spending, what are they eating? Because the open ocean can be kind of nutrient poor. It can be devoid, it can be often sparse. So this is kind of the big questions that kind of came to our minds. How are they using the ecosystem offshore? So we designed a study, and Chelsea and I decided to study, and we went down to Monterey Bay, California, because we found it's a deep water ecosystem that's close to shore. The continental shelf comes right in, and we started a bit of a pilot study to catalog and distinguish the killer whales in that region. Well, that grew. And it ended up, we met a lot of other researchers that wanted to get involved, the public, and we ended up extending this all the way up to Northern Oregon, Astoria, including all the way down to Point Conception. So this was the total range. Kind of what we're finding, as I mentioned, we have potentially this outer coast transient group that spend time offshore. We also see these offshores, which I mentioned before, that are shark eaters, and then also the gray box animals that we think may be oceanics, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. So first off, though, the California current. This is an ecosystem that's very important to most of us here. It is cold water, brings nutrient, coastal upwelling. It is what feeds us when we're fishing. What we depend on is this ocean current, very important to us. So everything in this area is important for killer whales and other marine life. So here it's a large transboundary ecosystem, so that spans both, actually 3 countries. Transboundary being that it's British Columbia, Canada, United States, and Mexico. It actually goes all the way down into Baja. So it's a very large cold water and sometimes warm water current, depending on climate fluctuations or El Nino events or La Nina events. It encompasses 4 major water layers. So for instance, cold water being transported south, And then there's sometimes this current that kind of flows north that is warm, so during the wintertime. And then you also have really nutrient-rich water, nutrient-poor water that flows from offshore. And then you have really nutrient-rich cold water coming up from below. Like when it hits the side of the continental shelf, it gets transported to the surface of what we call upwelling, bringing nutrients. Highly productive. So we went down the coast looking for killer whales. That was the big goal. And we visited places like Point Lobos, California, the Oregon coast. Chelsea and I spent time talking to park rangers, talking to other scientists, fisheries, and we're trying to figure out how do we set up a network to collect this information to learn more about the whales. And surprisingly, it wasn't hard to get people interested in killer whales. A lot of people are mostly focused on gray whales, of course, that's the main species you see here. But this whole network of people had information to share with us. So we spent time at the Depot Bay Whales Center and talked with a lot of naturalists there. And also we discussed it with NOAA scientists that had posters up along the coast. Have you seen a killer whale? In particular, the southern residents of what they were looking for. So findings from all of this, what have you really seen? So all the reports have been coming in from people. We've been tracking, working with aquariums like Seaside Aquarium, working with Oregon Coast Aquarium, the University OSU, Oregon State. They've been sending all their information to us. We've compiled it into this big database now that we have. It's a master database, we call it. And first off, though, we did some lit review. And we found there was very little information. This was one of the only papers I was able to find about killer whales off Oregon and southern Washington coast. And it was done in 1992. And really what you got to take from this is that what they found was very few killer whales. But what was interesting was that the killer whales that they did find could not be identified. But there was no photos to come with it. So we really don't know if they were resident killer whales, if they're transient, what form of killer whale they were. So that was the kind of the driver for why we did this research. So when we took all this data, we worked with a couple of a great guy, a good friend of mine. His name's Kevin. Kevin Lester. We took the spatial analysis and we've been running where all the sightings have been happening. And what we found here, based on all the photographs being sent in, looking at the individual whales, which I'll explain our photo ID process in a few minutes, is this is the spread. Each one of these is a sighting, an observation of killer whales on the Oregon coast. And you can see the oceanic being way far offshore towards the open ocean, past the continental shelf break, which is the lighter area along the coast there. We also see these outer coast individuals that are further offshore as well. And then also a lot of these coastal animals that are spending their time feeding on seals and sea lions right along the edge of the coastline, coming into small bays, into the jetties around the coast. That's kind of what we're seeing. If we zoom in though, yep.
You have a basis for judging how, obviously, we're seeing a lot more dots along the coast, and it's like, well, yeah, there's a lot more people that see them.
Yeah.
Do you have a basis for judging how much that's biasing your sightings and therefore guessing how many more there are farther out?
Yes, the effort is a huge problem. So effort bias is a big problem in ecology. So for instance, for this map here in general shows you kind of the highest density of sightings are going to be places like Newport or Depot Bay or Goose Bay. And that's the big heavily populated areas where people are spending their time on the water. But what we're finding too, how we're kind of dealing with that now, is we are looking at the distribution, because we actually know where most of the orcas are, who they are. We're able to track other sightings all along the coast. So for instance, in Washington State, we also take all the recordings of sightings off of Washington and British Columbia, as many as we can, and we identify the animals to individual. And then also our spatial scope, we try to limit it to certain areas, but there's always going to be the problem of dealing with spatial effort, which is in ecology is something that's almost fairly difficult to account for unless you're doing systematic line transect surveys. So if we were to set up a systematic study, that would change how things are done. You would likely see very few killer whales from that standpoint. You're going to spend time doing these transects up and down the coast in that way, but you would also lose the aspect of being able to collect the identification information, a lot of the behavioral information, because you're spending time on these specific tracks and counting whatever you see as you go along. It's a fine line, the two types of studies. And they have done some transect surveys, and what has been shown is that there isn't a high density or population of killer whales in the Oregon region. But those studies have only been focused in certain years as well as in certain times. And the problem with that is that how expensive those surveys cost. It's a win-win. It's a difficult situation to try to win. Great question, though. But this is a photograph of one animal that seems to be spending his time quite a bit down here. We've had multiple sightings of him, and he's a transient we know as T49C. And how we know who he is his little notches on his fin. You can kind of see these two little nicks at the back of his fin. When they get these injuries, killer whales they keep them like basically like a scar. And we can take photographs of them, and we can identify the same individual over time. And we've seen him multiple times now. This was actually near Newport by our colleague Lee Torres at Oregon State, and he was in there hunting harbor seals. But we've seen him consistently having sightings of him up and down the coast the last couple of years, in and out of areas. Yeah.
Are they born with those?
No.
It's like something.
Sometimes they are born with marks, scars naturally that they get, but it's usually they acquire them over time. Sometimes we'll get an animal that we've taken a photograph of, and he'll have no notch, there'll be no scar or anything on the fin, but we can still see a certain shape of the fin, and then maybe a year later, we'll see him again, take a photograph, and he'll have a new notch or something that he may have gotten from the environment, or say tackling a sea lion and bit him back, or another whale could have, roughhousing, similar to human beings, that kind of thing. They acquire these over time. So kind of what we're seeing based on a lot of the sightings that we've been getting, which is really interesting, and this, once again, could be related to observer effort, is definitely what one issue we're kind of trying to work out, but is a lot of the sightings are happening in around May and June. And there's been several studies that have shown, systematic studies up in Washington state, that have shown a period of time where transient killer whales up there are predominantly seen between July, August, and September. So, and for us though, down in Oregon, it seems to be May and June. And a couple things come to mind. Harbor seals. Harbor seals are actually one of the most abundant marine mammal species in the entire Pacific coast. And they also have what we call a seasonal climb. So throughout the entire North Pacific Ocean, they tend to breed at different periods of time. So in the coastal waters of Vancouver Island in Washington state, we see harbor seal pups being born around July, August into September. But off the Oregon coast, it's a little earlier. It's about May, June, as when pups are seen to be born. And the studies that have been done off southern Vancouver Island, Washington, have actually shown statistically through their studies that there is a relationship between transient killer whale occurrence patterns and harbor seal pupping periods. So there could be some period of time that transient killer whales might be following the decline of the seal pups. And there was actually another study that looked at this in Southeast Alaska as well, that found transients started to show up more. And that makes sense when you have your dominant prey species, which we found 60% of the diet has been harbor seal for transient killer whales. Reason being, they're easy to kill, they're small, they're not difficult to capture compared to other things like an adult sea lion, which can be a lot more dangerous, or a large whale, like a gray whale. So, for instance, we took some of this data. This is just an interesting look. We were talking with Brian Wright at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who does all the harbor seal counts for all the haul-out sites along the Oregon coast. And we plotted the data to kind of look at, where maybe some of the transient killer whales are spending their time. You can see here is we call it density heat map, and the areas where harbor seal density is greatest is the bright colored yellow, and then the lower densities are, of course, up river mouths or up in areas near estuaries, but some of the higher density areas, and trying to see if we can find some sort of pattern. This is all very preliminary. We're kind of currently working on putting together a report on this. So California, though, is another interesting location, and we're finding a lot of really neat findings from the killer whales we're seeing down there. So we believe that some of these animals represent a potential outer coast population. So the ones I mentioned earlier that spend time far offshore. And most of our sightings come from Monterey, which, before I get into that, though, I'll mention that the behavioral ecology work we're doing was really kind of founded from a lot of the initial work that was done in the 1980s. So I mentioned the harbor seal relationship with killer whales. This is some of the work that was done in the 1980s and 1990s by Robin Baird and Lawrence Dill, who looked at the differences in transient killer occurrence, group sizes, how they hunt, and the different prey. And numerous papers came from this. So for instance, there's that harbor seal pupping season right here. With the transient killer whale occurrence, you can kind of see in between July, August, and September, they found in their study that transient killer whales occurred mostly during that period of time. And there's a nice picture of a transient hunting at a harbor seal hollow. The fin is in the back there, just behind the hollow site. But our study, we wanted to know what was really happening with killer whales that spend time in open water and what their behavior was like compared to some of the individuals we're seeing more coastal. So these are two large males we know as Liner and his brother Charlie, his nephew Charlie, and they spend a lot of time in Monterey Bay. And Monterey Bay is really interesting because it's a deep water canyon system. So there's a large submarine canyon that bisects the middle of the bay, bringing the continental shelf really close to shore, which means it's an open ocean kind of environment. So this group of approximately 155 killer whales kind of come here. This is all our sightings from Monterey. So we collected sightings similar to what we're doing in Oregon right now, but we also conducted field work. And this is a mix of field work as well as sightings that were in this area. You can see that canyon that kind of goes up the middle here. So we had 261 observations of killer whales now for Monterey. And what we're finding through a density analysis here is that a lot is happening just over the middle of the canyon area. And that's kind of interesting because right now some of the work we're currently on the middle of publishing shows that there is a relationship between the habitat use that they're using in Monterey with the prey they're hunting. So we did focal follow studies. So a focal follow is a behavioral study where you find a group of whales and you spend hours and hours and hours following them, taking detailed notes on what they're doing, the movements. So we take a latitude and longitude georeference location of where these whales were, and we would then do that every 5 minutes, and then classify their behavior based on certain things like what direction they're moving, if they're erratically moving, how long their dives were, what if they're interacting with other marine mammal prey. And what we found was really interesting. This is based off 100 focal follows. So our research vessel, which is within 50 meters of the whales, is following the group. And when we take these lat and longs, we kind of start to see the patterns of our boat because we're within the whale, following the whales, how the whales are kind of moving in general. So what we found in general over the 100 encounters were these kind of patterns, and we defined these activity states, which an activity state is the type of behavior they're exhibiting. So for instance, we found foraging, which makes up what we call shelf break or canyon foraging. And the bottom just on this side over here, over the canyon, you can kind of see it kind of follows the edge of the canyon. You spend a lot of time searching for prey just in around the 200 to 500 meter isobath, so just following the edge of the canyon. We also found open water foraging, which is in the top, my left. It's very erratic behavior. We also found prey pursuit, which is not on here because it's hard to visualize prey from a map, but they chasing prey is part of that as well. And then feeding behavior was another thing we defined. When they're actually consuming prey, we timed that, looked at how much time they spend feeding. Traveling, so that's another thing. So traveling would be up in the top right. And that is mostly just going from one location to another looking for prey. Socializing, spending time breaching, tail lobbing, spy hopping, things like that. And then we also looked at resting behavior, which was spending time logging at the surface, often not moving much, doing long dives, 5 to 10 minutes beneath the surface. Yep.
I don't know whether you'll get to it, but we've always heard when we saw these whales you're seeing there, that they could be underwater for like 30 miles, 20 off the whole coast before they come up and out. So are you saying you have data on that shows that how they come out and feed, or how we don't see them that much? Because it seems like they say, well, they happen to be underwater and they're clear. They don't travel, they don't come out of the water for the feeding.
Yes.
You follow me on that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So killer whales are known to hold their breath anywhere between 5 to 20 minutes, 5 to 7. I think 17 minutes is the record. for a killer whale. But typically they spend their time on shallower dives. So it's often within 3 to 5 minutes. They don't spend that long underwater. Typically, a surfacing pattern is they come to the surface, take a couple of shallow dives within 10 to 20 seconds. They take a breath, go down, take a breath, go down, and then they do usually a long dive between 5 to 7 minutes. That's harder to follow, depending on the kind of behavior. So, for instance, the open water hunting is the zigzagging, kind of all over the place.
Right.
It's hard to follow them that way. Typically, but you often we could follow them for quite a long time.
Well, to follow up, we got certain signs that are saying whale watching. So do you have a pinpoint that when they're coming, maybe in this area, they'll normally come out of the water and they're already under before they go? Because you say, well, we spot a whale just only in hot spots. The rest of the time they must be underwater.
Yeah.
Do you know that the pattern of them, how they're coming when they come out of it?
Yes, usually when we approach a group of whales when we're doing research, is we stop, we look at what they're doing, and get a general feel for them, the direction of travel they're going. So we'll sit there, kind of watch them come up at a couple of surfacings. They'll come up, breathe, and then if we wait, and then we see kind of they moving north or they kind of moving south, and after a while, you kind of it's actually an important thing to do, especially if you're out in your boat, is to kind of assess the situation when you're watching killer whales and learn kind of what they're doing. And they have a bit of a pattern. Typically, with especially resident killer whales, they'll kind of go from one direction to another. They'll go from headland to headland.
Are they pretty consistent when they come up that pretty area? So they've got it pretty well timed when they're coming out. It's not.
Yeah.
That's why they have these spots that to see them, because history says they'll come out of the water that period of time, like on the hills we see that.
Yeah, exactly. Gray whales, I mean, it can be much more difficult. Other species like gray whales can be very much like they'll be in one area, but they'll go to feeding locations kind of all over in one area. Killer whales can be difficult. Transients can be difficult depending on what they're doing. If they're open water hunting, they can be really erratic, kind of all over the place. But if they're traveling, often you can follow them and they're pretty consistent. It just really depends. Sometimes we have days where you follow them, you lose them, they're gone, and they're just like, oh.
They're underwater traveling.
They're underwater traveling, and they kind of can duck into a small bay. Like especially with some of the coastal groups we see, they can go into a small bay into very shallow water between rocks where harbor seals are, and it can be easy to lose them. And especially if it's foggy, that's another thing too. Weather conditions can be all problems, all things that we collect information on. And sometimes you get bad luck with animals, and they can just disappear, especially the ocean. But these are some of the behaviors we've been able to classify. And these are all our focal points. So this is the 100 encounters right here. This is all our boats when they're with killer whales. And an encounter can last anywhere between 15 minutes to 9 hours. So sometimes we're following whales from morning to dusk, and we're collecting behavior information on them consistently. So this is a lot of information all on here, but it just shows some of our effort as we're following individual groups of killer whales. What's interesting, so here's what we call an ethogram, or it's the different behaviors that we see, and hunting takes up a significant amount of time. What we see mostly is foraging behavior, canyon searching, so looking for prey, that canyon foraging, which takes up about 26% of the period of time they're out. We're watching them for that period of time, and this is based on daylight time, and not nighttime, what's happening at night possibly, but we do know they're acoustic animals, so what they do at night might be similar to what they do in the day from other studies that have been published. Open water searching, very similar, 25%. It's a different kind of what I said, like how we distinguish these behaviors. Open water hunting is a little bit different in what it looks like. Feeding, though, is higher than prey pursuit, which is really interesting. So prey pursuit is actually attacking the prey. So going after it, trying to subdue it, trying to kill it. So say hunting a gray whale or hunting a sea lion. But feeding takes up a lot more time because some of these prey, like a gray whale calf, takes a lot of time to eat. So sometimes we'll be watching for hours as they sit and feed on a dead gray whale or a sea lion. Traveling though, resting is really low, and we looked at it, it's approximately 1%, and we compared that to other studies that have also done behaviors, and they also found similar for transients with around 1% as well. This is the seasonal pattern though. So similar to kind of Oregon, but other transients up and down the area. We saw most of our studies, most of our encounters and observations happening in April, May. And that's an interesting time because as you can see down here, the three main species of prey they go for are just California sea lion, gray whale calves, and elephant seal. Gray whale calves are the only time of the year it happens is during this April, May, when the gray whale calves are migrating with their mothers from Mexico up to well, either Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska. And that's the only time we also see them hunting gray whale calves. So not even on the southbound journey back down to Mexico. So we do know that at least during this period of time, killer whales are spending, and we looked at this statistically, and it was significant. So the results do show that there is a period of time that transient killer whales are seen more frequently than other periods of time, likely related to gray whale calves. Group size, so percent of an occurrence. So to deal with effort a bit in this study, we adopted what we call a concurrent day analysis, which sounds confusing. It's a little bit weird to think about, but other studies have used it, where we counted the number of days killer whales were seen. So a particular group that could be identified, how many days in a row they were seen. So we looked at how many days, one day that a group was seen, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and what we found is that 4 days seems to be the period of time that killer whales are spending in Monterey. And likely if it's within 4 days, it's one occurrence, but if it's after 4 days, it should be considered a second occurrence. So they've likely left the area and come back. That kind of makes sense. It's a way to deal with some of the issues of animals being in potentially being counted twice or seen by multiple whale watchers or people counting the same group. So an occurrence here, a majority of group size that we witnessed, so the amount of whales in a group, was around 5 to 6 animals. So in a hunting group, you can see here, this is observed group size, number of animals during foraging events. So the largest groups, though, we've seen groups up to 25 killer whales in a group, and these often involve hunts on gray whale calves, so very large groups. And here's an interesting graph. We took Noah and our research group collaborated, and we looked at their data for gray whale calf counts. So since 1994, NOAA's been collecting counts of gray whale calves coming up the coast of their mothers. And they found that years that fluctuate with how many calves are being born in Mexico. And we wanted to know if the number of individual killer whales off of California might be related to potentially the number of gray whales. And what we're finding is that the largest numbers of individual killer whales seen off California coast occurs during this gray whale period. Now, you might wonder, the gray whale period kind of looks a little weird. It goes from being 0 to like 3 to a huge peak. And that's just because by the time that you get to June, the gray whales have headed north of California. All the calves are up north. They're up to Oregon, up to Washington. So that data, that's the reason you see that kind of drop suddenly, is because the counts end during June. There's no more calves to count. So diet, though, well, we've seen a bunch of different species that are fed on by transient killer whales. Springtime, California sea lion makes up the dominant prey that we see, and that's really interesting, 33%, but it's also the most abundant species of sea lion or marine mammal actually off of California. We also see gray whale calves in the spring, harbor seal, elephant seals, harbor porpoise, some smaller cetaceans, Dall's porpoise, dolphins. But then the rest of the year, California sea lion dominates. We don't see gray whale predations anymore. Calves are predated even when they're southbound. When they're heading back down to Mexico, the gray whales, we don't see any hunts happening. It's likely by that time the calves have grown, gained enough energy, or a little bit more difficult to kill at that point. Sorry for the pictures, a little bit more gory. During predation events, though, we do see some interesting hunts. Sometimes gray whale hunts can last from between 4 to 6 hours. And we found that transient killer whales often share prey. This is a gray whale calf that was being hunted in Monterey Bay, and often they'll ram the head. They use what we call separation behavior, which up in the top right here, you can see a gray whale mother and calf. The killer whales use separation behavior where they'll try to get between the mother and calf, push them apart so they get the calf on its own. The next step they go to is what we call incapacitation behavior. Incapacitation behavior means we're going to try to stop the calf, try to kill it. So often it means ramming, trying to reach on top of it. until the calf tires. And by this time, the killer whales have separated the mother and they're able to subdue the calf. And then the last one would be submergence behavior, and that's often try to drown the calf, try to push underneath the surface. Often these hunts are successful. Gray whale calves are pretty young at this point. They're 3 to 4 months old, just coming up the coast with their mothers. So their energy levels are quite low at this point. Their mothers are tired because they have spent the whole winter feeding a calf and not eating. So they need to get north. And often this is when the killer whales kind of know what's going on. They target the gray whales in Monterey, right over that deep water canyon. Gray whale mothers, though, have abilities to fight back. We've seen them turn over on their backs and put their calves on their chest out of the water, on their ventral side of the water. We've seen them use their flukes, like the mother up here, to smack at the killer whales. We do know they go into kelp beds in really shallow water to try to get away from killer whales. So there is a lot of anti-predator behavior that we witness as well, and some calves are saved. And there's quite a few. There's much more calves than killer whales that are available. But not all survive. This is a calf that washed up on a beach near Monterey, and it died from killer whales. You can see this is what we call rake marks. Those are the teeth marks on the side the killer whales leave on the carcass. So we get photographs of this. I don't know if you've met or heard of Jim Rice. He's at OSU. He's a stranding coordinator for OSU. We talk a lot with him, and he's described gray whales that have washed up on the coast of Oregon that have also had similar scars and marks on them that are potential for killer whale predation. Yep.
It's kind of gross. How many,
No, that's a great question. We go back. We've seen groups of up to 25, and we're not too sure what the reason for that is. 25 is a lot of killer whales to feed on a gray whale calf. And in scientific literature, whalers used to describe that killer whales would just take the lower jaw and tongue and leave the rest. And we've seen that in California as well. We've also seen them feeding on the whole carcass, though. What we're starting to think, though, based on the social dynamics of killer whales, is that gray whale calves might act as a kind of a potluck. So it's a time of the year when multiple groups of killer whales would come into the Monterey area that aren't typically seen there to socialize. And they use the gray whale hunts as that, because that's a lot of killer whales to feed. One gray whale calf for a lot of killer whales to feed. So we're still kind of looking at that social dynamic a bit more. It's a great question. But this information is super important because it has many ecological connections. One being that we're currently in what we call a mass mortality, unusual mortality event for gray whales up and down the coast. Where multiple individuals, gray whales, are actually dying and washing up. There's been a couple of these different mass mortality events they believe that can be related to climate change. In the Arctic, where they're not getting enough food, females that are actually having calves early on their way down before they hit Mexico. And by that time, they don't have enough energy stored to feed the calf for the extended periods of time. And also changes in the benthic food that they eat in the Arctic. So predation, though, can have a significant impact as well as climate change. So understanding the predator component is important. What we do know, though, is that gray whale calves don't go to waste. Studies by McInnes, which is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, have found that whale falls, where a dead calf goes to the bottom, may feed entire communities of deep water organisms that in these environments that are typically what we call nutrient poor or oligotrophic, provide these whale carcasses might actually support these large communities for extended periods of time. But we're still not sure the impact or how much energy transfer between the surface waters to the benthic, how important it is. But this is actually from McInnes. They studied a whale fall. So this is a whale skeleton that they tracked through time on the bottom of the canyon. And what's really interesting is in some of these whale skeletons, there's species of marine worm that are only found, have only been identified on these skeletons, on these carcasses, nowhere else. So there's whole ecosystems that are currently that we could learn a little bit about, and potentially because of killer whale predations. We are proud to present. We just published a new book with Noah. It was published yesterday. So this is available for free online. It's 135 pages. It's got a catalog of killer whales, and it's available. It's more of a naturalist history book, so it talks about what I just went over with killer whales and gray whales and foraging behavior. It's online, available for free, so I can provide information for that after the presentation. My last thing I'll go over though is the photo ID work we're doing. So from all of this work tracking killer whales in Oregon, tracking in California, we've collected identifications of individual whales. So for instance, this male here, as I mentioned, we recognize him because of the scars on that gray saddle patch that you can see there. We collect catalogs of these animals. We take pictures like this, and we can recognize these whales, and we catalog them. So over time, we build this big database of individual whales, like a fingerprint, almost in a way. So we collect them from whale watchers, ecotours, NOAA surveys. NOAA supplied a lot of data for this study, as well as through our own work, like our research vessel here at Monterey, going out and doing our behavioral studies. We were able to consolidate a lot of this photo ID work. So once again, here's a map showing our complete study area for for collecting this photo ID work and all our sightings that we have up and down the coast. And then it's not always fun though. We don't always get to spend time on the water. This is Chelsea spending most of her time, and I was there too. Don't worry, I wasn't lazy as well. The Moss Landing Marine Laboratories were very nice enough for about three years to let us use their facilities. And for every 8 hours we spend on the water, we spent probably just as much analyzing photos, thousands of photographs in the library and research areas, just trying to put together documents and papers. But what we found was from this whole database, so we looked at photographs from 2006 to 2018. We identified killer whales were encountered 146 times during that period. We analyzed over 100,000 photographs during that, from 2015 to 2018 is when we did our analysis. We identified a total of 150 unique whales that are spending their time off of Oregon and California. And 30 different families, so matriline, so it's a mother and her offspring. So we found 30 different groups. And this is how we ID. This is a famous individual we call Emma. She's well known for attacking gray whales, her and her little matriline. This is how we ID them though. So each animal gets a number. So OCT for our catalog database means outer coast transient. And then she's the 30th whale that we identified. So she gets the 30 number. And then if she has an offspring, it would be 30A. And if she had a second offspring, it would be 30B, and 30C, and 30D. Now, if her offspring, 30B, has an offspring, then it's 30B1, and then P2, and P3, and so on. And we can build, and then also looking through time here, you can see here, this is an animal. You asked about the notches. This is an actual animal through the photo ID process that we tracked throughout this entire study. When he was a juvenile in 2006, all the way to he was an adult in 2019. And you can see how his fin changed through time. And he's got this notch that kind of grew with him. This is her family. So this is Emma at the top. That's her proposed brother, who you saw the photograph earlier. His name's Liner, OCT 60. That's her other son, Charlie, who you met earlier too as well, OCT 30C. That's her daughter, OCT 30B, and her grandkids. So she got 30B1 and 30B2 as her grandkids. And this is the matriline family, similar to elephants, mother and her associated offspring. This takes a lot of time, many years to try to do something like this. And a lot of this research was started in the 1970s by Canadian scientists in Vancouver. Discovered how to do this whole ID process. And we call them the gray killers because they're quite well known for tackling gray whale calves. This is what the data started to look like from the number of unique animals that we identified throughout, the cumulative number of unique animals throughout the study period for California and Oregon. It's continually going up. As of now, I think we're up to 180 animals now, from 155, we go up to 180 now. So we're continually identifying new groups. We compare our catalogs to other catalogs from other researchers, and if they're not in the other researchers' catalogs that are published, and we don't know who they are, we end up giving them a new ID like that. That's where this comes in. So this is what's really caught my attention. Trying to strong arm all the tuna fishermen that spend their time offshore, or I can't go half the time because I'm in a stuffy office, is individual whales that we're seeing very far offshore, 300 kilometers or more, that are feeding on marine mammals. similar to transients, but we have not been able to link them to it in association with known killer whales that we know of. And we've identified 60 of them now, and we don't know who they are. But from that, I'll go back to that in a second. From that, we just published this in 2021 with NOAA. It's available freely as well. It's a catalog of all those animals that you can look at. And if you're on your boat, you take the catalog with you. And it provides all that information. So if you have photographs, you can compare it to, and it's publicly available. So this is these oceanics right here. So this is a big male. And what's really unique about him, and we didn't know who he was, is you see where the arrows are pointing to, he has these weird scars. And one of them is really fresh. It's kind of pink. So now we're up to 60. We had 40 at the time during the study from 1997 to 2021 from the data we collected with NOAA. No links in association, as I mentioned. Found predominantly seaward of the continental shelf. So up to 370 kilometers is the furthest that we found. Encountered feeding on marine mammals, similar to the transients that we're typically seeing. But they have these cookie cutter shark bite marks. So a cookie cutter shark is a warm water, deep pelagic species. So they're found in water temperatures about 18, 19 degrees Celsius or warmer, but typically far offshore. And none of the killer whales that we photographed from Oregon or along the outer coast here in California have these scars. Only the individuals that we're finding offshore. And these scars potentially correlate the fact that these animals are spending time in open, deep environments and warm environments. So we're still not even sure at this point where they fit in. Are they their own ecotype, not transient, not offshore, not resident, or are they transients that spend more time, offshore or different populations? We have no idea, and that's kind of where I'm just trying to steal my way onto boats and to try to find more of these individuals that are really interesting. So lastly, we believe that from the work that we're doing, we believe there's potentially a coastal group and an outer coast group that form this west coast population between Southeast Alaska to Southern California. So typically two stocks that likely need habitat protection and conservation that differ from each other. One being spending time in deeper water offshore, one being more coastal. And this is the plotted data. It's kind of hard to see here, but the plotted data, the blue dots up at the top are all these coastal animals we've identified. So you can see Vancouver Island, other coastal Washington, but latitudinally down in the red dots are some of these outer coast ones of California. So there is a difference we're seeing in who's being identified between these two different regions. So Oregon seems to be this transition zone. And this is all because of the data we've been able to collect. But I would like to thank everybody for this presentation. We have so many people that we work with and been supportive collecting the data. And I'm going to be adding the Friends of HSTAT on it too. But we have so many people that we work with, including OSU. NOAA has been huge in helping us with this work, supplying photographs and data, as well as some of the other companies we work with and go out in the water. But thank you very much.
You mentioned killer whales going after all these babies here. What are killer whales? Whoever goes after them or kills any small, they
have no predators.
So they're just expanding on their own. They're not worried about anything else or anything.
No, so killer whales are the top of the food chain. They're what we call a quaternary predator or an apex predator. And the thing is, though, with predators at that height, their birth rates or their reproductive rates are quite low compared to, say, deer or, like if you think of more herbivores or more lower on the food chain or trophic level prey, they have higher birth rates than, say, killer whales. Killer whales are very low, actually. Killer whales have a 50% mortality in their first year of being born. If they get past the first 6 months, it's pretty good, but during the first 6 months, it's pretty high. And especially and that's based a lot on the killer whale studies that have been done on resident killer whales, but we believe it's very similar for transients. But we are currently going through in the last 5 or 6 years, almost a decade now, actually, I'd say 10 years, we're going through a bit of a baby boom, where at least up in British Columbia and Washington State, transients have increased. And we think that's primarily because the harbor seal population is increasing too as well. And same with sea lions. You're seeing a lot of reports of sea lions increasing quite a bit, but the killer whales are following with that. And what we're seeing with conservation-wise, which is a bit of a patchy subject, is the sea lion situation with fishing and killer whales. what needs to kind of be looked at is the fact that killer whales rely, especially transients, rely on seals and sea lions as their prey. And everything in nature has what we call logistic growth, where you go up, the prey go up, the predator go up, but then the prey is going to fall at some point. Either they're going to out eat their resources, they fall, the killer whales will follow. And this just goes on, similar to the famous study with elk and wolves in Yellowstone. So in this case, we're seeing this baby boom. Killer whales will drop as soon as the prey start to drop on.
Well, they go after themselves, try to fight for survival, where there's not enough of them around.
Yeah.
And how old, do you got anything on age? These killer whales, they live for a long time, so they may be.
Yeah. So killer whales, they've never seen any sort of aggression. Like we do see kind of temperament things happen within the group. We do see, because we know scars happen on the saddle patch. We see these big rake marks from each other. We do know there's some hierarchy. It's female run, so it's run by a matriarch. It's so in males, in that case, what we're starting to learn now is males kind of most of the older males do most of the breeding. It's what has been found in the residents through genetic studies. Age-wise, though, they live quite a long time. Female killer whales have been known to live from anywhere on average between 50 to 60 years, and some of them up to 80, 90. There's believed a southern resident to be around, she was anywhere between like 83 years of age and 104, they believe, based on photographs by fishermen of her back when she was an adult back in the 19th.
So what, where they die of, you know?
Disease like humans. Males, by the way, live to about 30 on average, 30, 40, and a maximum of about 50, 60. They die of things like heart disease. Tooth infection seems to be one thing. Pneumonia has been observed. Gastritis has been observed, like similar things to humans. They also have a reproductive span similar to humans. So for instance, they hit menopause, females, at the age of about 35 to 40 to 45, and that stops, but they live on, which is unusual in nature. They live on to have grandchildren and do what we call alloparenting, which is they take care of their daughter's offspring. So that's similar to humans. There's a lot of connection. Caregiver. So there's a lot of important connections there of why they live like it. Because a lot of species don't when they hit. And males, the interesting thing is males stay with their mothers for life, especially in resident killer whales. It's transients is a little bit more fluid. The males will take off, but both forms, they still form a strong bond. And particularly in resident killer whales, they'll stay with their mother for their entire life, which is unusual because in nature, staying with your mother's group can mean incest, it can mean competition, it can mean a lot of things. So males usually get pushed out of the group. But in this case, it's very unusual to see a male being in the family their entire lives, even in elephants and that similar. Yep. Oh, yep.
I just have a question about, since we're all foraging, like, why is this, is it lack of data or something that you're not understanding, study, but like, what is so special about Oregon that it's so unknown, like what's going on here?
Yeah, so we've always known that transient killer whales are distributed throughout the entire North Pacific, right? As I showed, and the West Coast being from Southeast Alaska down to Southern California. But there has never been anything published on Oregon. We know they're here, but and the habitat is different here. The ecosystem along the Oregon coast is high energy, open ocean, sandy coastlines. There's different population sizes for the prey, so harbor seals, California sea lions, stellar sea lions. But there's no information to try to understand the habitat uses for the killer whales when they're in this area. So that's pretty important, especially if you're trying to set up protection or some sort of conservation for them when they're here. That's where the information you need, the broad scale patterns of what they're doing when they're here. But what they're doing here might not be exactly what they're doing up in BC or in Washington. Exactly. So that's a huge thing. Citizen science, there was a systematic study done in Washington on whale watch data. They found that whale watch data can be used accurately to describe distribution as long as limitations are provided, but also if you have the identification of the individual whales, taking photographs is important, and they're correct in identifications, and if you limit your spatial scope. So, for instance, if you focus in a particular area that's not too broad, and also not too narrow. So there's certain things you can set up in that study to kind of adjust for that. Yep.
Where are the closest?
That, cookie cutter sharks have been studied by a lot of different scientists, especially in fisheries. And I've read numerous papers on them, and it's so gray. It's the area is so gray. Like it's there. I mean, there's been, especially because ocean circulation patterns like currents and that can be so complex, and that it's three-dimensional that they can move. So warmer water can come inshore, or it can be anywhere. They've had sightings of them in the Channel Islands of California. It's really hard to say. So there could be some periods of time where maybe some of these killers were getting bitten by these sharks in more coastal areas. But the thing is the killer whales that we typically encounter never had cookie cutter bite marks. We've never seen them in any of the photographs that we have. And we know those animals spend more time coastal. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say where they're found. I mean, I haven't seen much info. I know they're saying between the 18 to 20-degree water temperature seems to be where they spend more time in the offshore deep water.
It seems as though you were saying they only feed on other mammals. Is there some reason they don't want to eat fish?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the different killer whale ecotypes and around the world, killer whales are found globally in all oceans, warm, cold. They're found in the Antarctic, the Arctic. They have these different ecotypes, and so far scientists have found 10 different ecotypes. And there seems to be either mammal hunters or fish eaters. In the Antarctic, for instance, there's 5 ecotypes, and we have a mammal hunting couple mammal hunting populations and a couple of fish eating. And what it is because what we believe is that there's a shift. The different types of prey require different kinds of behavior that are adapted to hunting. So, for instance, a mammal killer whale, for instance, had to learn and adapt to hunting mammal prey, which probably took a long time to do. Where tackling fish would take a whole different social structure. So what we're seeing with residents and transients, for example, resident killer whales live in these big, large groups, 25 to 30 animals. Or transients, as I mentioned, live in these 5 to 6 animals. And that social structure is different because it's for foraging. You can live in big groups because a fish aren't attuned the same way as a seal is. So you're able to go after a fish, and if they see you, it doesn't matter. Like you're going to be able to get them. But if say a seal, though, seeing a group of 25 killer whales coming at you, it's going to be an eye opener. So hunting in a small group means that you're going to be able to coordinate your hunting better. You're going to be able to tackle that prey. You're going to share that information with each other. But say if you wanted to hunt fish, it would take a whole different skill set. So often, likely, this is what has happened over generations, and maybe started what we call social isolation, where individuals would spend more time with other individuals that hunted the same way, and that kind of how that whole progress, and then you become genetically isolated, and eventually over time, that's how you branch into ecotypes.
But it sounded as though you were saying that there weren't any fish eating populations along the.
No, the residents are. So the
Okay.
resident killer whales, which are a whole other population that you can focus hours on too as well. The offshores, shark eaters, typically are fish eaters, right? And they eat sharks, but they also have been known to eat halibut. They've been known to eat opah, so other species of fish. And then the transients are only mammal eaters, and that's based on thousands of hours of observation from other scientists, as well as over years and years and years of watching foraging, but also through stomach contents. So whales that are washed up, you open the stomach, there's never been fish in them, unless it was a fish from another marine mammal that was inside the stomach, which has happened. And then also through what we call biopsy sampling. So taking a biopsy, getting a blubber tissue sample, you can actually look at fatty acids and tell what the animal is actually eating based on what's being accumulated in their fat.
What's your goal in the future? What's your objectives?
Well, we're kind of in the initial stages. It feels like, even though it's been going on for a while. I think our next goal is, for me, I'm finishing up at the University of British Columbia shortly, and I'm in talks with collaborating more with OSU, the Oregon State University. I really love the Oregon coast and the people down here. So, and California as well. Like I love the entire coast. I think it's all very special. But Oregon's kind of winning my heart. I think I think I'd like to try to set up a more long-term study here and focus more attention on killer whales in Oregon. I think that's
We'll
the,
look forward to seeing them.
I think, as mentioned earlier, I'll say it again, we have a great sightings network if you're on social media on Facebook. It's called the Oregon Coast Killer Whale Group. We have other Facebook groups too as well, like Seaside Aquarium, all these, other groups that come in and join. And basically what people do is they post their sightings there and you can follow where the killer whales are being sighted. It's been very successful the last couple of years, particularly the people in Newport, for instance, for an example, we had a sighting and everybody was posting on this thread. We have a thread where somebody says killer whales were seen at 10:50 a.m. Suddenly you have everybody comment, oh, they're here at 11, they're here at 11:15, they're here at 12. And it worked out really well. And people, people were saying, well, this is the first time we've ever seen killer whales in the Oregon coast. Thank you so much. And it's just been so successful. And we share updates on things, presentations, and also right now our big goal is to collaborate with other groups. We're talking about writing a NOAA, similar to that killer whale document we just published yesterday. We're going to write one for Oregon, a separate one. We're talking about it now, and what we're going to do is team up with other organizations like Seaside Aquarium, Oregon Coast Aquarium, OSU, get the whole marine community involved, and write a nice naturalist-based book on killer whales, all the sighting information, add photographs from people, and describe it with an Oregon culture to it. That's kind of what we're discussing now, which hopefully won't take us too long. We've got a good template now, so.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that killer whales rest. How do they rest? Is it like a regular shark? Do they have to be moving or?
No, that's a great question. Killer whales don't rest like humans do, for instance. They are mammals, of course. They rest if they often take what we call a cat nap. It's often they can shut off half their brain, keep the other half going. And they often are what we call involuntary breathers. So killer whales actually have to wake up to breathe. So they will often go down for 5 or 10 minutes, kind of below the surface, or 5 to 6 minutes below the surface. Then they'll come up and breathe. Often it's very slow movements though. So their movements they barely any headway against the current. So they're basically stationary. And they kind of huddle together like they're a cuddle group. And you'll see like a whole family together really close. And they show off that half of their brain, and they basically just kind of go into this. I'm not too sure the exact physiology of the neurology behind it, but they go into this napping period.
So they don't do it by themselves. They're with a group.
Yeah, they usually nap as a group.
Is this on a diurnal cycle?
We actually it's throughout the day. There's been studies now with tagging equipment. So we use what we call suction cup key tags, which can be attached onto a whale. You get a big pole and the suction cup, and you put it onto the back of the killer whale, and it sticks on for 12 to 24 hours, and it pops off. And they've been finding through those, you can kind of look at the movements of the whales, and you can look at how long they're going down for, where they're moving, and they've been able to look at behavioral data in much more detail than a focal follow. And that's kind of a goal that we're looking at too as well. But they can kind of look at resting, and what they found, resting, foraging, those different behaviors, what they found is that it can occur throughout the day and throughout the night. And that makes sense. Killer whales and dolphins are acoustic. So they rely, even though they have great vision, sometimes better than humans, they also, but in murky water, they rely on echolocation to actually find their way around. So they use echolocation like sonar to locate prey, to find their way around reefs or shallow areas. And that ability, acoustics, doesn't matter if it's night or day at that point. It can still make their way around. So likely their day and night periods are a little bit, probably not the same. But there was a study published for transients that transients don't rely on acoustics really to find prey. Because their prey can hear them. So salmon don't have the same hearing abilities, or fish don't have the same hearing abilities as a seal or sea lion, which is a mammal. But transient killer whales, and here comes the big question about foraging adaptations. They use passive listening. Often hear splashing. So they hear a seal splashing in the kelp bed or a sea lion splashing. They use passive listening to pinpoint where the seal is. And then often they'll use, and they won't communicate. They often no vocalizations because the seals or sea lions can hear them. And we've seen this. There's been acoustic studies with underwater microphones that reported this. that the killer whales will actually find the seal or sea lion based on this passive listening. But the end stage of the hunt, when they're on top of the seal, they're likely rely on vision to tackle the prey during that period of time. So at nighttime, this one suction cups VTAG study they did at night, they believed that there was more foraging that was occurring at nighttime than or during the day than night, likely because they relied potentially on vision to, at least in the last stages of a hunt.
The cycle might be, or not properly be considered a cycle, but in response to the presence or absence of prey.
Exactly. So it's still though these are most recent studies that are still kind of more need additional studies.
How can we, all this, get this information like clear picture and stuff? All this, and get the word out to get all these pictures to get more help.
That would be great.
Just like a general, like, website that.
Yeah, so right now we're finding being at the university. You can find my information at the University of British Columbia. So I'm in the Marine Mammal Research Unit, as mentioned earlier. I have a profile there. There's my email there. Everything's there. You can contact me anytime. But we found the university is so limited that we are just because we're so busy doing our degrees and working up. We said we need something more. So we're actually creating a nonprofit now to actually try to focus our attention. That's the oceanic group that we're creating because we've had so many things that we'd like to do. And to get those photographs to us, you can just send me an email. Let me know. I have a Dropbox I can put together and just drag and drop in there. I'll tell you who the whales are if we know them. I provided you information on their last sighting. That's what we've been doing. The Facebook group is great too. The Facebook group, we've kind of made it so we consolidated the sightings in there. We've kind of strictly monitored it so that it's only Oregon locals because it's so easy to keep track of the sightings that way. A lot of groups out there we find post a lot of information about whales, but the sightings get lost in the information. So we keep it so when a post gets posted, like someone posts about killer whales, it's that post is focused for the day. And then you easily can go in there and track where these whales are being seen. And we can also track their movements in a way by people reporting where the whales are seen over time. So the group is very much a focus for Oregon because you're the people that are going to be contributing the data, not people that are living in Alaska or living in Washington. Or it's for people that are here to really focus their attention on killer whales and yeah, hopefully get a good opportunity to locate them and see them. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of your data on sightings moves from south to north following gray whale migrations or upping schedules. Do you have a lot of information on their southbound?
Yeah. So what's interesting about that outer coast and that coastal and outer coast group, the coastal group of killer whales that we see, like a lot of the transients we're seeing in Oregon along the coast that are going into like the jetties and into the reefs and along kelp beds, aren't the whales that we're typically seeing hunting gray whales. So it's really weird. What really sparked my attention when I was in California was a lot of the park rangers up here and other people along the beach were saying, "Oh yeah, I watched a film about kill a gray whale cat the other day from the beach off Oregon." I was like, "Really? You get a picture?" No. And so I was like, "Oh, that's still really interesting because I wondered who the whales were because we know the whales in California that are hunting gray whale cats are the same whales moving up the coast." So what we found though, because we're collaborating with OSU, Oregon State University. We're kind of working on a study right now. I can't go too much into it, but what we're finding is that the data we've been collecting is the killer whales, the gray whales that are being studied by the researchers at OSU are being seen sometimes where killer whales are being seen, transients. But the transients that we're identifying from the photographs aren't typically whales that hunt gray whale cats. They're ones that hunt harbor seals and are usually seen in Washington, D.C. So, and we have yet to see any predation event or any sort of interaction between them. So there could be some sort of specialization, foraging specialization that's specific to certain groups of transients. So for instance, the ones in California likely have adapted and learned how to hunt gray whale cats and are specialists that way. Where the ones that we're seeing off Oregon along the coast or up in BC are likely specialists in harbor seals. And harbor seals are a lot easier to kill than a gray whale cat. So maybe not as energetically feasible for them to take on that gray whale calf when they can get enough nutrition from a harbor seal.
It sounded like you were saying that they sometimes use an active echolocation where they're making a sound and they're getting the echoes.
Yeah, so echolocation, a lot of times it's used for communicating for locating prey as well as finding your way around, say, reefs. And that. Resident killer whales, the fish-eating ones, use echolocation and vocalization. So acoustics like whistles and calls, they use it quite a bit because they're going for prey that's not necessarily sensitive to acoustics like seals and sea lions. So resident killer whales use a lot of it, but transients don't. After a kill, though, after we witness a group of transients killing a seal or sea lion, they often become very vocal right away. So often they're quiet when they're hunting, but then once they've made the kill, squawking and squealing and party time. The family gets together.
That.
Yeah, and it's often when you watch them hunt too. It's long, like the long dives, very quiet. Like they're hunting, they're very stealthy. The transients, hard to follow sometimes. But after they make a kill, we see them reaching and jumping in the air, and it's likely because they found their prey. There's no need to be sneaky about it anymore or how you stealth. But residents, on the other hand, they're chatterboxes all the time. Yeah.
When you talk about the gray whale calf predation, do you ever see any interaction between orcas and like white sharks around those kill sites? And then similarly, when you're talking about the offshore orcas and their shark eaters, what types of sharks are they eating?
That's a good question. So the transient, so for instance, killer whales and white sharks, that's the first part of that question. There has been some interesting studies that have come out the last few years. One being South Africa. You've probably heard in the news that killer whales in South Africa have become notorious, particularly 2 adult males in South Africa that learned that they like shark liver. And they've killed, they think, 17 sharks in like 2 months, white sharks. But in this part of the coast, there was a report in the 1990s. It was in California, Farallon Islands, which is a white shark haven. And there was a killer whale that killed a white shark there. And after that, the white sharks just disappeared for several weeks. There was a paper published in 2019 by Salvador Jorgensen, who is a white shark scientist at Monterey Bay Aquarium. And they looked at all the different occurrences of killer whales that were off the Farallon Islands and the white sharks, because they had tags on white sharks to see where the white sharks were moving. And they looked at what happens to white sharks when killer whales in the area. And what they found was a lot of times the white sharks just took off for long periods of time. But the problem with the paper is that we didn't really, I spoke with him afterwards and he was kind of like, oh, I wish we would have chatted more, was that we didn't have the identifications. There was offshore killer whales, there was transient killer whales. So it was kind of hard to see who the culprit was. For instance, the one that killed the white shark wasn't a transient. It was a weird animal they called, it was part of a pod called LA pod, which we don't even know what the ecotype is. It's a group of 17 whales that came up from Southern California, showed up for a couple of years, ate a bunch of stuff, and then took off, and they haven't been seen since 1997. So that group is, who knows where they are. They could be in Mexico hiding low, they killed too many white sharks or something. Maybe they're wanted by the white shark mafia. I don't know. But then there's also the offshore killer whales, which are shark specialists, and what we kind of see them feeding on. What has been documented is Pacific sleeper sharks, which is a big one. There was a study in 2011. They were following these offshores, and a bunch of livers kept floating up the surface, and oil slicks around the shark livers. So they took the shark livers, took them in, got genetics done, and they said, "Oh, they're sleeper sharks," and the killer whales were feeding on them. And then they've also seen six-gill shark was one, blue shark, but white shark hasn't been on the offshores yet. I haven't heard that. But what we do know is why they potentially like the livers. It's very oily, fatty. The liver of a shark takes up almost 3/4 of the body. So, and that's important because sharks use that as a buoyancy tool. They don't have a swim bladder similar to fish do, so they need the buoyancy from the liver. So it's full of what's called squalene, which is oil, fat-rich oil, right? So killer whales, and the rest of the shark is cartilage, which isn't very nutritious. So the killer whales in Africa were going up the sharks and surgically using their teeth to cut open, grab the liver, take it out, eat the liver, and leave the rest of the shark. So how they knew is the sharks were washing up all over the beaches without their livers. So the killer whales had learned how to get at the shark liver. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, where I live, I have a pretty good view out over the ocean
You're an important man.
from my dining room, and I quite frequently see sea lions with their flippers extended, to see gray whales going by, and occasionally seals. Only twice in the 60+ years I've been there have I ever seen orcas that I realized were orcas.
Yeah, it's tricky. Uh, And I think part of that might be, it could be difficult too. I mean, killer whales, the surf down here can be really difficult. Weather in Oregon's a lot rougher than it is up in British Columbia or Washington. We're protected in our little homely inland waters. Or out here, it can get quite rough. Seeing them can be difficult. And as I mentioned, transients are quite stealthy. They can dive for 5 to 6 minutes, and they often go really close to shore. They can be right in the surf line, where you might not see them, but a little black fin that might pop up, and then they can surface somewhere else. They can go right into small bays. We actually published a paper in 2019 where we saw killer whales intentionally strand onto a beach, hit their bodies right out onto the beach to grab a seal up in Washington, similar to what they do in South America. So they can go into super shallow water, into areas that are difficult for you to maybe potentially see or view them. They can be behind reefs. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're still around. And the best way to find killer whales, what I would do, is get a set of binoculars, be super patient, sit there and stare. 5 minutes at a time, scan.
I
5
have,
minutes
I
at a
have a
time.
life too.
Oh, I know. But that's the way we find them, is that because they're quick surfacers and they don't stay in one spot for long. They often surface and they move to another location. And because they're hunting all the time, once they made a kill on one spot, everything in the area, like a seal or sea lion, knows they're there. So for them to stay in that one spot, they want to hunt again, is not a smart move. So often killer whales will move and they can cover 100 kilometers in one day.
They don't spout water though up there. You can't see that.
What's that?
There's no water, no spout. All you're seeing is the fan.
Yeah, you in like a really calm day, killer whales do spout. You can see it, especially if there's sun. In a windy day though, like off the Oregon coast, the wind will just blow their you won't be able to see it. Yeah. The tallest dorsal. The tallest dorsal I've seen. Males their dorsal fins can be about 6 feet. The biggest so the size wise for different killer whales, which I wish I would love to do another talk just on other killer whales for you guys. The 3 ecotypes, the offshores are actually the smallest in size. The residents are medium, transients are actually the biggest. And how do we know that? They've done aerial photogrammetry studies where we use drones and airplanes to go over, and you can actually calculate. You can take photographs of the killer whales. As long it's like trigonometry, you can tell the height, the angle to the whale, and as long as you have the height, and then the length, like the length of your research vessel, for instance, is one way to do it. You can actually take photographs and then compare. And there's some fancy stats that deal with biases and things like that. You can deal with correction factors, but you can actually tell the size. And the largest transient that was recorded in one study got published in 2022. He's a whale we know quite well. His name is Rainy. He's a coastal transient that we see up in British Columbia quite a bit. He was 8.9 meters, which I think is 28 feet. Whoa. And he's one of the biggest recorded. And the largest killer whale, though, I think recorded was in the southern hemisphere. Near Antarctica was what we call a type A. I remember they measured him at, I think it was 31 feet. They can get quite big though, and their weight, male killer whales can get to be about 15,000 pounds. Females around 8,000, and they're quite a bit smaller.
Does the whale grow all of its life, or does it?
They stop at around 20 to 22 years. Physical maturity is around 20 to 22 years of age. So sexual maturity is around 14 to 15 years of age for both males and females. The male fin, starts to sprout when they get to the age of 15. So they go through puberty at that period of time. The fin sprouts. But before that, unless you get a photograph of the underside, because male and females have different colors and pigmentations, females have the mammary slits. So if a female breaches, you can get a photograph of the underside. You can't tell the difference between male and females. Very difficult until the males hit sexual maturity.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.